Cinderella, making chokers cool before chokers got cool, but she is iconic. She's one of my favourite Disney princesses. So you may be thinking, Rowan, why are you making this? What do you have the means for to make this dress? What's the purpose? And the purpose, I tell you, is the fact that I wanted to become a Disney princess. That is the reason. That's the only reason. Now you're going to see me making myself into a Disney princess. Subscribe and like, because it's free and it fuels my need to turn myself into every single Disney princess. I already have fabric to make myself into 2 more Disney princesses. And if you want to know what Disney princesses, then you should subscribe, because then you'll find out which ones. Let's cut to me. Less makeup and less fake hair, but more princessy. Let's go. I got these. I appreciate they're not the same colour, but I'm going to try and make it work. I didn't know how much fabric I would need from my main sheet, so I wrapped it around myself to make sure that it would fit me around lengthways, and I lied down on the floor to get a better idea of where it would hit on my waist/hip area and where it would hit on my ankles. So I have laid it out like this, and now gonna cut along the top. When I had initially laid it out, I had it folded in half so that I could see whether or not half of the sheet would be enough material for a full skirt, and thankfully it was, meaning that I could then use the other half of the sheet to do the bodice and to make any alterations onto the skirt that was needed. Due to the nature of the material I was using, there was a curved edge around the end of the sheet, so I couldn't just pin and sew the very edge of one side to the very edge of the other side to make the back of this dress. Instead, I tried to improvise as best as I could, and I pinned down a straight line down just the centre of the material, and then I cut off any of the excess material after I had done this. I tried to save as much material as I could for the skirt so that I could eventually end up pleating it. So I wanted to make sure that there was an even amount of material in all around the dress form. It wasn't more material on one side or more material at the back or the front, and the best way that I could think of doing this was putting the skirt on my dress form with a pin in the seam at the back, and then pulling it taut with the dress form in the middle and putting a pin into the front where it hit the dress form, and then doing the same technique on both of the sides, pulling it taut where the pins were and then putting a pin in the centre into the dress form. I then went around the edge, pleating the sides and pinning it in place. Before I ended up sewing it in place, I took the dress off of the dress form and put it around my waist to make sure that it would definitely fit me when I sewed it all up. I didn't necessarily like the fact that you could see all the raw edges of the top of my skirt, so I got a piece of material and I wrapped it around where my waist is, and I then added about a foot onto that so that I had any room for error or to add any sort of closures that I wanted at a later date. And I then cut this out probably about 4 inches-ish down, and then across obviously the bit that I just explained. And then I attached the skirt part onto my dress form, and then I pinned it into place before sewing the band onto it. I made sure that it was folded over probably about 1 to 2 inches over the bit that you could see. I'd just like to say that I put the belt around my waist before I attached it to the skirt part to then make note of where my waist was and how much excess material I had, and I marked off where the excess material would be on both sides with a pin, so I knew where it would fit around my waist, so that I then knew how much excess material I had on both sides. I then put the skirt in between these 2 pins before I sewed it in place, and then once I had sewn it in place, I cut off all the excess material on the bottom, but I left the two flappy bits on the side so that I could add any sort of closures if I wanted to. Now time to make this into a corset style top. You heard the lady. Let's make this into a corset style top. Now the way that I did it was I put down the material, the block material that I wanted, and I laid it down on the floor onto my carpet, and then I myself lied down onto the carpet on top of the material, and I got 4 pins and I stabbed through the material and the carpet, and I marked where the top of my shoulders were and then my hips, and I just quite simply cut around where the 4 points were to make some sort of rectangular shape. Where the rectangle was a little bit bigger than my torso that I wanted it to be, I folded it in half and marked off where my armpit was and where my hip was, and then cut off the excess material at the bottom of it. I then went in and cut a more rounded shape for where the bottom of the corset would be, so it was pointy in the middle and slightly higher up on where my hips were. I then cut out an exact piece of the same material so that I could have a front and back piece that I could put boning in the middle of these 2 pieces. I then pinned the 2 pieces together and sewed along both of the edges but not the 2 sides before I flipped it inside out. For the boning, I used zip ties. I got 2 pieces like this and I placed them onto the bodice piece where I wanted them to be, and I cut them to the shape and I hot glued both of the ends so that they wouldn't stab me, and I then put these 2 pieces inside the bodice piece from the little holes on each end, and I pinned them in place, and then I sewed down both of the sides of both of the pieces of boning. For the side panels, I cut out a piece of fabric that I knew would fit the width of my back, and I cut out 2 pieces of this fabric and I pinned them together on the long side, leaving the 2 shorter sides open. I then folded this in half and I cut down the middle. I then proceeded to sew the 2 pieces that were pinned together, leaving again the 2 sides open on now the 2 separate parts, and then I folded them right side out, I think the correct terminology is. I then attached my main bodice part and the back/side panels onto each other by putting my main bodice piece onto my dress form with the bit that I wanted people to see facing outwards. I then put the side/back panel onto the dress form with the bit that I didn't want people to see facing outwards, and pinned down the side that they would meet. Before I sewed the pieces together, I took the bodice part off of the dress form and put it around myself to double check that it would fit, and making any adjustments if needed. Thankfully I didn't need to make any adjustments, so I just sewed along where the 2 pieces were pinned. I'm going out in about an hour, and I want to do some of my dress today because I can. So I'm going to not do a lot to it. I'm going to sew up the back because at the moment it's just pinned, and it means that I can't try it on myself, which I'd like to do. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to see what time that gets me to. But first I'm going to try it on and see how many of these pins I can have not opened, so that I know where to sew. You got a tail. I was on the phone to my cousin yesterday and they told me how to do a time lapse on my phone, so I'm going to do a time lapse now because I know how to do that. I don't know if it's just because it's late or whether or not it's just because it's me, but I can't think of the proper words to use for this part, so I probably left about a hand's length from the top of the skirt downwards, and I then sewed up from then where the tip of the finger would be down to the very bottom of the dress. I really hope that makes sense because it definitely doesn't. I'm hoping to finish this today. That's what I want to do. However, I am doubtful that's going to happen. Instead, we're just going to hope for the best and hope that I can get this done. So I had attached the bodice piece onto the skirt piece because I was going to attach it today, so I had it in the middle and all along like the belt part where it would fit, However, there was probably about 1 inch, 2 inches of gap where you'd be able to see my skin underneath, and I didn't want this. So I got another piece of fabric and I made sure that it was big enough to hide this. It looked like almost like a big belt, and I hemmed one of the edges that you could see, and I lined it up with the belt that I had already put onto the waistband of the skirt. I lined that up and I pinned it in place, and then I pinned it to the bodice piece, and then once I'd done this, I then put the new belt line and also then the bodice piece through the sewing machine. I hemmed all of the raw edges that were on the back of the dress before I added in a couple of poppers onto like the skirt part of the back of the dress. To make the poofy bits on the side of her dress, I cut away some of the seams in the front and the back of the bodice. I then bunched up the lighter material and tucked it underneath the new holes, and then I sewed it in place. I did a similar technique with the sleeves. I bunched up the material on both sides. I put one at the back, one in the front, and then sewed it in place. I cut triangles into the main part of the skirt, cutting from the bottom to about mid-thigh and pinning and sewing the leftover fabric into it in a triangular shape. I did the same to the front, cutting from the bottom up to where the top met the skirt, then adding the lighter material in a triangle fashion, pinning and sewing in place to form some sort of front panel. Once I had finished the skirt part and I know I didn't need to add any more material to it, I went around and pinned a hem, double and triple checking to make sure it was even as I could get it before I sewed it in place, cutting away all the excess fabric so that it reduced bulk to the bottom of my dress. I then went and added a back panel to the bodice of my dress, pinning it and sewing it in place on one side. This way I could add closures to the other side when I needed to. I put the dress onto myself, marked where the dress would need to have closures, and then I took it off and hand sewed in a couple of closures. I took the lighter fabric and added a sort of triangle shape onto the bodice part of my dress. I covered over the boning that I had added a few days earlier. I folded the material over the top of the bodice piece, and I pulled up the skirt slightly so it looked a bit more seamless. I pinned this into place and I sewed it shut around the edges before I then did some alterations to the sleeves as well. Now you could say that this dress is about to get lit. I'll suit myself out. I turned my dress inside out, attaching the two very ends of the lights onto the back of my dress, letting the lights straight down as I draped them down from the waistband. I pinned them in place at the top and the bottom before I hand sewed a tiny point at each of where they were pinned. I then created a little pocket on the back of my dress underneath one of the ruffles to hold the battery pack in. I created a headband using the lighter material, wrapping it around my head to make sure it was long enough before folding it in half, pinning a straight line and then sewing the edge. I cut off all the excess material before folding it right side out and then sewing the two edges shut, folding the edges over slightly so it has a neater finish to it.